Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Welcome back, wildlings, and thank you very much for joining us on this joyous Christmas day. Here's hoping that your Yule is nothing like the holy holiday hell in tonight's story, Holiday Confessional, by Erutious. The door banged closed and roused Father Maxi from his doze. He'd been napping in the confessional booth, and had honestly expected not to be disturbed until morning. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." He glanced at his watch and saw that it was midnight on Christmas Day. He tried to hide the sigh that escaped him and managed to hide it nicely behind a yawn. Whoever's idea it had been to hold a Christmas Eve confessional was beyond him, but so far it had netted very few sinners indeed past 10 o'clock. Father Maxi had so far spoken to 2 drunks, parishioner Matthew, who believed that folding his sister's underwear was a sin, and a pervert who wanted to breathe heavily until he left a sinful mess in the box. He had hoped that the pervert would be the last, but this man had come in and ruined his celebration. "Father, are you there?" "Yes, my son," he said as he straightened himself. "Speak your sin, and I will listen." "This night, I did break into a house without consent." Father Maxi nodded. He was often privy to crimes, both the black sort and the less serious. He had heard more than one good Catholic who had admitted to coveting his neighbor's flat screen this week. He usually kept such sins to himself, but last year, when that crying man had admitted to raping all those children, he had been forced to go talk to Detective O'Shaughnessy, another good Catholic. Sins were one thing, but Father Maxi was not the sort of priest to let child molestation continue, as the diocese could have attested. This fellow, though, would most likely be sent on his way with a few Hail Marys and a Merry Christmas. "Very well, my son. 12 Hail..." "I'm not finished, Father. I can't go to the police with this story, and I know that you've always been a good boy who will know what to do with the information." Good boy. That phrase took him back a little. Father Maxi, a priest well into his 40s, hadn't been a boy in many years. "Continue, my son, please. I will listen." "When I came in, I went to the tree and began my work. I was half done. There were so many presents, you understand. And then I heard a noise upstairs. At first, I ignored it. With 3 children in the home, someone was likely to be a light sleeper, but as I worked, the noise became louder. I finally recognized it for what it was, and the sound made me curious and a little worried. It was a child who was crying." Father Maxi leaned closer to the rectangle gate in the confessional booth. Despite the hour, the stranger's story had drawn him in. Through the shadowy hole of the confession booth, Father Maxi could see an older man with a white beard and a bald head. He had a cap in his hand and a garish red coat that now looked damp with the snow. Though his eyes were downcast, Father Maxi could tell that he had been crying. There was a smell in the booth again, something detectable only as an afterthought. Peppermint, maybe, with an underlying smell of horse stall or barn floor. I went upstairs to have a look. Sometimes I do happen upon scenes of a less than cheery nature, and I thought I might do some good for a needy child. When I reached the landing, I immediately knew that something was wrong. 'There was a dog slumped at the top of the stairs. I thought he was sleeping at first, but when I touched him, his head flopped to the side and showed me that his neck was broken. Rascal was never a good watchdog. I'd given him treats on more than one occasion to quiet him while I was there, and his friendliness, it seemed, had finally gotten the better of him. Then I heard the noise again and turned my attention to the children's room. Max was silent on the other side of the grate, held fast by the stranger's story. He told the tale as though it were an episode of Law and Order, and as he spoke, Maxie almost felt as though he was there with him. He could see Rascal, a mutt with some German shepherd roots, lying on the floor with his neck snapped and his friendly face still set in its eternal grin of slackening realization. The landing was dark, a nightlight spilling out, the only light to be seen from the child's room as the Christmas tree stood cheery sentinel below. He heard the whimper from the darkness and turned his eyes toward the cracked door halfway down the hall. How was the stranger doing this? I crept, not wanting to spook anyone if the child was just having a nightmare, but when I reached the door, I heard the sound again, and I knew that this was no sleeping child. The sound I heard was waking terror, the fear too dark to vocalize, and now its owner must suffer in crippled silence as the monster falls upon him. I pushed the door open, not caring who heard, and found myself in an abattoir. The room, you see, was small but big enough for 3 boys. 3 beds, each a different color and each with the boy's name stenciled on the foot, stood in a line. The other half of the room was free for play, and the floor was cluttered with toys and games. 2 of the beds were occupied, but not with the happy, smiling boys that I'd seen before. Some nights when I visit, I would peek in and see what dreams their faces painted. Each of them had always been a fresh canvas, a fine boy with Christmas morning prancing in their dreams, but tonight was very different. He fetched a deep sigh, and Maxie was afraid that he might stop. He was invested now and needed to know how it ended, no matter how terrible. Tonight, I saw that 2 of them would never dream again. The blood was garish red as it soaked into the sheets. Maxie gasped, unsure what sort of confession this was becoming, but knowing that it was like to be terrible. These 2, however, had been luckier than the 3rd. They'd been cut before they woke and thus had expired without knowing the terror that the 3rd now lived in. They were too old, you see. The monster that I had interrupted only preyed on the youngest of lambs. When I opened the door, I had inadvertently stumbled upon the blackest of tableaus. One was a child in flannel pajamas, smiling superheroes looking on in frozen acceptance from his top as blood oozed from one arm which he had raised to defend himself. The other, the object of his fear, was a haggard man dressed as Kris Kringle. His coat and his face were red with blood. His beard was matted with it as though he'd been chewing someone up just seconds before, and over his head was held a long knife poised for the kill. He paused for a moment as though to draw strength, and Father Maxie pulled in a frantic breath, his rapture too deep to breathe. When I saw him, Father, I saw that man dressed in red and preying upon a child's love of Christmas. I saw red myself. Another pause. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. On this night, I did knowingly commit murder. I knowingly crushed that man's skull against that frightened child's headboard, and I cannot say that my act was only to save the child. I felt wronged, blasphemed against. That he should take my image to inspire such fear was monstrous to me. There. I've also committed idolatry, I suppose. I compared myself to God, of which I am a so-called saint. I suppose my crimes and my sins are threefold then, but I would do it again to remove such a monster from this world before he could hurt another child. His words moved the priest, but also confused him. Was this man crazy? Had he really been a home invader turned savior, or was he... What is your name, my son? What name did your mother give you upon the day of your birth? Nicholas, father. I am called Nicholas. Father Maxie felt it hard to speak. His throat was tight with tears, and his mind was a stranger to him. Given the circumstances, my son, 12 Hail Marys should do it. You may say them on your way, for you have a long night ahead of you, if I'm not entirely mistaken. I do, Father. The man was almost crying. Then he faced the mesh rectangle, and Father Maxie could swear that he felt a warmth radiating through it. For just a moment he felt filled with a spirit that he hadn't felt since childhood. It was as though all the years and all the miles had been erased, and he received a portion of his faith back that Christmas day. His night, however, was far from over. He heard the man leave the booth and felt moved to catch a glimpse of the old saint, much like the child he'd once been, a child who had sat at the top of the stairs with his brother Aaron and waited all night to catch a glimpse. He wanted to see the man and prove to himself that the Christmas spirit was flesh and magic. He threw the curtain aside, his face awash with a rosy glow, but there was no jolly saint before him. No reindeer sleigh, no bag of toys or cheery elves, only a shivering, tear-streaked boy draped in a red coat. He had a large cut on his arm, just as the man had said he would, but was otherwise unharmed for someone who would turn out to be the last victim of a serial killer called the Yuletide Carver. He had killed 6 families that year, all of them killed in their beds, with the youngest child saved till last before being brutally raped and murdered. When the police arrived at the young boy's house later that morning, they found his dog and his parents and his 2 brothers all dead in their beds. Their throats were slashed, and the weapon they found would match the wounds and all the others perfectly. The last body, the one dressed in a Santa costume that he'd likely stolen from the mall he'd recently been fired from, was found laid across the last bed with his skull caved in, the murder weapon clutched in his frozen hand. That would come later, though. For now, the priest bent down before the boy like a penitent before the cross and inspected his injuries. He wasn't hurt too badly. He had a long, jagged cut on his arm, but his eyes told the priest that the worst injuries were below the surface. Maxie raised the child's face, a handsome and well-made face that would likely find little trouble finding a new home if none of his family could be found, and asked him about the man who had saved him. It would be the statement in all the papers the next day. It would be the headline used by many to paint an end to the long nights that had held the city for so long. It was Santa, the real Santa. He saved me. So be good, if only to each other. Stay scary, and make the most of your nights.